Wonderful. Okay. All right. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined already. We are here to connect and learn from Anirudh Suri. Anirudh is a policymaker, he's a technologist, he's an entrepreneur, investor, and the author of The Great Tech Game. Anirudh, it's a pleasure to be here with you today as your fellow classmate and also your friend. I bought a copy of your book and I finished it just on a flight to India here a few days ago. And I love the book. I really did. What I loved about the book was that it was really excellent in its research. It's really rich in its historical insights. It's a very timely book. And it also offers us some really useful frameworks for how technology is shaping the global world order. So excellent book, and I really am so proud of you and very thrilled that so many of us can pick this up and have such a great read and so many new insights. So I thought I would start our talk today by asking you what inspired you to write this book, one, and two, this incredible title. Why did you name it The Great Tech Game?
No, thank you, Priyanka. It's obviously a pleasure to be here with you. Who would have imagined? Like when we were at the Kennedy School together, that I guess over now 10, 12, 13 years later, we'll be having a conversation about a book that I've written. If we were to judge our time at the Kennedy School, I don't think I expected this. But yeah, so I think the inspiration for the book, Priyanka, was a few things, right? One was that, since the Kennedy School, but even before, I had been, engaged with technology in a few different ways. Prior to the Kennedy School, when I was working with McKinsey or with the Carnegie Endowment, I had looked at how technology was shaping, various sectors, right? So at that time, this is now, 2007, 2008, the onslaught of the new tech firms at that time, right, who are now considered the tech giants of today, the likes of Google and Amazon, etc. They were, much like they are today, they were threatening to upend certain industries. And while I was at McKinsey, some of the work we did was to look at how would the incumbents deal with such challenges to their, industries and their established positions, but also the other way around. How would some of these challengers really become the incumbents of tomorrow? But the underlying trend there obviously was that industries were getting transformed, entire sectors were getting transformed, economies were getting transformed by technology. Prime Minister Modi, I think, is in the US still, or maybe he might have just left. But back in the day in 2005-06, when I was at the Carnegie Endowment in DC, that time, again, it was a similar time of euphoria for US-India relations. At that time, basis the US-India nuclear deal, right? Where again, technology and technology transfer and permission of certain countries to do advancements in certain technologies like nuclear technology at that time were at the core of how the US-India relationship was getting transformed. And there was similar talk even at that time of how the India-US relationship could really change the regional order, at least at that time, in the Asia Pacific. Now, of course, today the talk is about how the US-India relationship can be critical for the global order also. But all of these experiences, both prior to Kennedy and then since, the decade since Kennedy, while I've been in the technology startup and venture capital world, and even in the Indian government for a little bit, I think the summer when you were also in Delhi, and I was working in the IT ministry as a policy advisor, all of these experiences have led me to see technology and its impact on our world and our economy and our society from various different perspectives, right? A long-winded answer to say that actually, in my mind, a lot of these dots were connecting, but I was not seeing these dots connect in the public narrative or in the mainstream narrative, right? Technology was often being seen only as either a particular sector that was based in Bangalore or Silicon Valley or, other such tech centers around the world. But really, technology was transforming our world across, right? No matter what city, what town, what village, what sector of the economy, what country you were in, or what, whether you're in the public, private, or non-profit sectors, is really transforming your world. So the goal for me in writing the book was to leverage my own experiences across these multiple sectors and connect the dots and then draw out that big picture that would at least place in historical context and in a broader context what was going on in our world today, right? And that links back to the second question you asked, which is why I call the book The Great Tech Game, right? For those of us who've studied international relations or the history of the last 200, 300 years will know about the great game that was fought between Britain and Russia in Central Asia about 150 odd years ago for control and dominance of that part of the world, because that was considered like the territory that the British Empire and Russia were gonna clash in, right? No matter how that game played out, for me, technology is the new great game in today's era, and that's why I thought I'll take a spin on that great game, as it's known to international relations students and historians, and call this the Great Tech Game to explain what I thought was going on today.
That's excellent. So Anirudh, what is, let's get into the game, right? So what is different about this great tech game than other historical games that you described in the book? And please, for all the viewers and listeners, walk us through some of those games for people who have not read the book. So what is different about this great tech game vis-a-vis these other historical games? I mean, technology and innovation has always been an enabler and driver, right? So how is this tech game different than others?
Yeah, so no, absolutely right that technology has often been has been an important factor, right? No matter what part of history or any era that you look at, some kind of technological innovation has often been important in determining the winners and losers of that time, right? And that's really part of the story that I try and build. Um, it's just that it has not been as big, as consequential, and as spread out a factor as it has become now, right? So some of the great games that I talk about in the first section of the book, which is the historical section of the book, which I call the great games of the past, I talk about agriculture, I talk about trade, global trade, I talk about colonization and industrialization, and then capitalism as some of the great games of the past. And technology being the great game of today. But all of these great games of the past, as I thought about them, um, had a few common factors, right? So there was often a key shaper. There was often a key shaper in that era of history that shaped who the winners and losers were. In the agriculture great game, or the great agri game as I call it, it was really countries or regions that mastered the art of agricultural productivity by mastering irrigation techniques, or you can call it irrigation technology, seed technology, right? Mastering which seeds, in what form, where they would grow well, where you would get those additional yields, that then leads to the kind of phenomena that Yuval Harari has also described in his book on Sapiens, etc., about how that allows complex societies to develop, right? But the trigger has been in that era that increased agricultural productivity, which often has come from, again, technology at that time, right? The ability to master the flow of rivers, right? Have irrigation all year round as opposed to just during the rainy seasons, etc., right? You go on to the global trade game or the great agri and trade game piece, and then you look at how navigational technology is key to allowing Western European nations to come across, the coast of Africa and somehow beat the monopoly of regions like Egypt and the Ottoman Empire and the Venetians, and really start off that era of colonization, right? It was really navigational technology that allows them to do that. Otherwise, for them, the route to Asia was blocked by these established players of the time, which were Venice and the Ottoman Empire and Egypt and folks in that area around the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, right? And fast forward to capitalism and industrialization, and you look at how much the steam engine, electricity, inventions of that time allow countries like the Great Britain of the time of that era, or America later, right, to really fast forward their own economic growth and productivity much more compared to established countries of that time, like India and China, right? And they then combine that with geopolitical power in the form of colonization, often to fast track their industrialization even more. And that leads to the concept of developed nations and developing nations of today, where there's such a big gap, right? The first great divergence happens then. In all of these great games, there has been that mastery of the game of that time, right? And to me today, the game has changed again. Like, we cannot be playing the game of agriculture or game of industrialization and think that we'll become leaders in today's world order. We have to play those games of the past also. There is no country that has managed to industrialize without mastering agriculture in some form or the other. You know, before Great Britain becomes a massive industrialized nation, it also masters agriculture, or at least controls agricultural resources in the Americas and India and where else, right? So we've got to master some of the great games of the past also. But really, the game has moved on to what I call the great tech game, where you've got to master, the tech game of today. You've got to have a dynamic tech sector, a dynamic startup sector. You've got to be doing R&D, IP development in those spaces if you're going to have economic productivity that's superior to other countries or other regions. And we'll get into that more, but really I place this great tech game in the same bucket, as you can tell, as industrialization, colonization, or the advent of agriculture as the great games of the past.
So this might be controversial, but getting to India, Anirudh, I mean, I would go on a limb and say, India did not fare well in the colonization game, right? We lost out on the industrialization game. So how are we going to fare now in this great tech game? I mean, I'm hearing themes from you of access and mastery in the tech game. How have we fared so far in the country?
So I think it's been a mixed bag, but I think it's been there's a lot of cause for optimism though this time around, right? So you're right that we lost out in the colonization game, we lost out in the industrialization game, we lost out in the capitalism game also, right? Because we, as you know, and as many people on this conversation with us know, that was not the route that India chose at the time of independence either. Right? One can argue that we lost out in the global trading game also, at least on the oceanic side to a large extent, right? A large part of India actually did not participate in the global oceanic trade that was enabled by some of those navigational technologies that I was talking about earlier, that the Portuguese and the Brits and the Spaniards mastered at that time, right? We continue to remain land focused. So we lost out on a lot of games, with the exception of maybe the great agri game, where by virtue of our river-based civilizations, we actually did quite well, relatively speaking. So in today's great game, it is all the more important for us to make sure that we don't lose out again. Because as you can tell, when you lose out on any of these great games, the impact is multiple centuries of relative, you can say, lack of prosperity and progress for your people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the importance of why we need to make sure that we get the game this time around, and not stay focused on a previous game of the past, right? Now, how are we faring? I think, see, I put 5 different factors as a way to assess, where any country is, whether it's India or any other country. So you've got to look at whether you have the talent, one, or labor, right, for this game. You have to look at whether you have capital, access to capital, and whether you're unlocking capital to unleash entrepreneurship, unleash sort of enterprise. You've got to look at technology itself. Are you developing core IP, core technology? Are you doing R&D? Then the 4th piece is policy. Are you putting in all the right policies in place? It's very easy for us to, as it has been in the past, to shut out capitalism because we thought that was not the right way. And so policy actually, in retrospect at least, was not in our favor, right? In previous games. Now it's very important to get the policies right this time around. And the fifth piece is a strategy. We've got to have a strategy in place about what is our role in this global tech ecosystem, right? So now to answer your question, I'll go through all of these 5 pieces quickly. Do we have the talent?
Mhm.
Of course we do, right? I think that compared to any other era or the great game in the past, today for the tech era, for the great tech game, we do tend to believe that we have some of the best talent in the world, right? India is considered to be a talent nation.
Mhm.
Services, startup entrepreneurs, top tech executives, right? Globally are coming from our country, from our institutes, right? So we do have the talent. Now, are we capturing all of that talent and its benefits for the benefit of India? That's a separate question. But yes, we have the talent to begin with. And that sort of mindset to begin with. That's one, right? We are not worried about how many people in India are going into STEM, unlike, let's say Europe or America, right? So that ways we are, I think, well positioned. Capital, I think the game has changed in the last decade and a half, right? I've been in the venture capital world for the last decade. The kind of access today, Indian entrepreneurs at any level, startup or, the likes of a Reliance even, or a Geo, access to capital is really not a concern as much as it used to be. That's number 2. So that again, we are doing fine on. Now the last 3 pieces is where I think it's a mixed bag. So on development of tech or development of core IP, on doing R&D, we are lagging. 0.6% of our GDP is being spent on R&D compared to 3.5%, 4% for countries like China, Korea, Taiwan, etc. I think even the number for the US today, for the kind of economy and size that the US has, I think it's close to 2.5%, 3%. And so India is really lagging on that R&D piece. Unless we do that R&D, there's no way we'll develop IP for ourselves, for our companies, for our research institutes. And that's a big gap, right? We can talk more about how to fix that, but that's a big gap that we don't talk about enough, right? The US-India conversation today in Washington, D.C. is about the engines that GE will co-develop in India. That's really scratching the surface, in my opinion. We've got to be doing R&D across the board in various subsectors of technology, right? Whether it's climate technology, whether it's defense technology, whether it's a whole range of technology sectors that I can name, right? Where we are not doing enough in India. When it comes to policy now, I think that the last few years have been good. On policy, I think the policies of the Indian government, both at the central level and in certain states, not all states, certain states have become very conducive for development of technology, nurturing tech talent, bringing in large tech companies, fostering startup ecosystems, right? We are trying to figure out our stances on privacy and data and all of that. It's taking some time, but generally we are in the right direction, right? Strategy now, the 5th element of what the framework I gave you, Priyanka, is also, I think, generally on the right track, but not fully there yet, right? Generally on the right track because I think we realize the importance of tech now for our economy. We understand that we've got to do a lot more in bringing in large technology companies across all sectors. It's not just about Facebook, Twitter, Google, and Amazon and Microsoft. It's actually about GE. It's about Qualcomm. It's about Cisco, right? It's about solar technology. It's about green hydrogen technology, right? So I'm seeing the signs that we are getting it, but are we well placed to win in a lot of those sectors basis the strategy today? That's something we can talk about. I don't think we are fully there yet, right? So I would say it's a mixed bag basis those 5 factors that I just described.
So that's excellent. Like I was saying, the book is really good at offering a lot of frameworks, and I like this 5-point framework. Follow-up question on the capital part. You said, if technology is the new wealth of nations, India is doing well and has competitive advantage in the talent aspect. You said capital. But capital, most of the investment in our technology firms is coming from foreign capital sources. Am I correct? Is that going to help the country in its monetization in the future? Or do you think there needs to be some sort of change in pattern where most of the capital is domestically flowing as well?
See, you're right that most of the capital coming into the venture capital industry, for example, that's fostering the startup ecosystem in India is largely foreign still. Um, I think I don't have the exact numbers off the top of my head, but my guesstimate right now would be in the range of 70 to 80% is foreign capital in one way or form, and that number is is actually generally steady, but the share of domestic capital is growing. So now, is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. Is it ideal? No. See, India, by virtue of the colonization that we've been through for 200, 250 years, is not as wealthy in capital as Europe is, or America is, or some other countries are. So we don't have that much capital to begin with, right? Our accumulated wealth in India is much lower, and hence there's much less capital to unlock in the first place for risky enterprises that startups tend to be, right? So it's natural that a lot of that capital will come from foreign sources to begin with. The good thing, however, is that domestic capital is following. It's not that it's not following foreign capital. It's very important for us to have capital, whether it's foreign or domestic is a secondary question. First question is, do we have the capital to fund the enterprise of our entrepreneurs, right? Who want to take part in the great tech game. And I think that on that we are getting capital. Now, your question is at the second level, is it ideal to have more foreign capital than domestic? No, but I think that ratio, by virtue of the historical factors I just described, will inevitably be a combination of foreign and domestic. There's a lot of work to be done in India to unlock domestic capital more, right? One of the stories I tell about the great trading game back in the day is how a small country like the Netherlands becomes a big trading power. Is that it? And similarly with actually even with England, but Netherlands is a really instructive example. It's a small nation on the periphery of the great game at that time, which is being played out in the Eurasian landmass, and Netherlands is like as far away from it as a country could have been. How does that nation, a small nation, become a massive trading power? It unlocks domestic capital. How does it unlock domestic capital? It goes down to two things. One, it unlocks municipal capital. It says, okay, all of you, I know you can't afford to give much money to all of these trading expeditions that the entrepreneurs of the time are undertaking, but give small amounts. So I'm going to make the risk really small for you, and then pool in all that money so that now together that's sufficient capital, as opposed to large. It's almost like the Obama strategy of small donations will overcome nations, right? So Netherlands does that really well. It also starts off the first stock exchange in the world. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, for those of you who don't know this, the first stock exchange in the world. Right? So now you have a country that somehow uses that to then fund trading expeditions to other parts of the world. And the result is today Netherlands still is one of the biggest trading countries in the world, right? Also, so now the lesson for that for India from a capital standpoint is get capital, however, one, but second, also unlock domestic capital, to your point, right? And various ways to do that. I think SEBI and other agencies in India are trying to do that. There's a much better regime now for startups to list on the public markets. That's one of the ways in which domestic capital also flows more into these startups and tech enterprises. So there's again progress, but you look at the newspapers and you look at talk about angel tax and how easy or how difficult it is for angel investors to invest in startups. There's still some gaps there to be filled. So I think there's again like a mixed story there, a lot more to be done, but you're absolutely bang on in that domestic capital has to be unlocked more.
You give a positive note in terms of talent and capital, right? And a little bit of a grim picture on the aspect of core technology, right? So we missed the boat on colonization. We didn't fare well on industrialization. And here we are in this tech game where we have to compete. We have some competitive advantages, right? But what about, I mean, do you think we missed the boat on things like monetizing on our our knowledge and transfer around Aadhaar or payments? Was there an opportunity for government to be able to monetize in that direction? And are we thinking about that right now? Are we embarking on that?
So that's a great question, Priyanka. Very insightful question, because also, as you would have, for those who are following the Aadhaar story, as you know, many of us, I think we have some MPID friends here. Back in the day when we were at Kennedy, many of you will recall that some of our classmates were working with Nandan Nilekani when he was setting up, along with a bunch of others, today what is known as the India Stack. The foundations were being laid at that time in 2009-10, and the philosophy of India has been around the digital public infrastructure has been that of, again, a soft export strategy, right? We want to use that as a soft power tool, not a hard power tool, not a tool that we will monetize, as you're rightly saying, alluding to, but really a tool that we will add to the global discourse on how global digital commons should be governed, right? It's supposedly our contribution now to how the global digital compact should be thought of, right? And the in that sense, the philosophy underlying Aadhaar and UPI and the India Stack is, I think, incredible, right? Because we're really saying that it's not gonna, the power of the digital commons should not lie in the hands of a few private sector firms, like it's supposed to, from a US standpoint. It should not lie in the power of in the hands of the state, like people say is the Chinese model. It should not lie, again, in the hands of the regulator, as people say is the case in the case of Europe or the European philosophy around this. It should really lie in the commons, and it should be open source. It should be consent based, and a lot of those principles that underlie Aadhaar should now apply to the global digital commons, data of the individuals, and so on and so forth. And e-commerce and logistics and a lot of these sectors that are today dominated by a few private companies should not be the case. It should really be a global digital public infrastructure that anyone can build on top of. This is the underlying philosophy.
Mhm.
Now, should we have monetized it? It's a great question, and we can discuss it maybe in the Q&A with others who are on the call. But my sense is that at some point or the other, we've got to enable Indian companies, and not just Indian companies, really global companies, to build applications on top of the digital public infrastructure layer that India has built and is hoping that other countries will replicate. And I think of it like the following, right? To me, India has built out, like Apple built out the iOS, Google
Mm.
built out the Android, or rather acquired the Android operating system, and then built out this ecosystem where entrepreneurs around the world could build apps on top that were useful to users and citizens around the world. I think that India should think of what we are building, the digital OS for the world. Right now, it's very important that we allow innovation to continue to happen on top of this layer, right? We should not let this layer become stagnant. This digital public infrastructure should not become like a road that 10 years down the line is just full of potholes and has not
Mm.
been renovated and innovated upon. That's, I think, very important. And second, we've got to allow entrepreneurs and private enterprises to build applications on top. The monetization will come from that layer.
Mm.
Now, can India as a country, as a government, think of monetization? It's a very complicated question. A lot of conversation is happening around it. But I think at the very least, the ecosystem should be built in a way that the applications and the enterprises that are built on top that are innovative should be allowed to make money, right? I think that's very important.
So building on that, you're in Delhi. So, I mean, as a stakeholder of government, so in the ecosystem, you've got the government, you've got the private sector. Where do you think government is doing well? Where have we really made some wins in this tech game? And are we building on anything from the past? I mean, what is our progression, or are we replacing any characteristics or aspects of the prior games? Where are the wins in government, and where are the wins in the private sector in India? Walk the viewers and listeners through that in terms of each of the stakeholders.
Sure. So see, I think in one of the chapters I talk about how if you go, many of us have either lived in Delhi or have spent time in Delhi, right? Including yourself. Within 1 hour of Delhi, I talk about this in the book in I think chapter 4 or 5. Within 1 hour of Delhi, you will see all the great games of the past that I talked about coexisting in India. You will see the great agri game. Within an hour, you will see farms that are still farming along practices that were probably dominant in the Indo-Gangetic plains of India several thousand years ago. You will find small trading hubs. I mentioned Khurja as one of those pottery hubs in UP, about an hour away from Delhi. That you can very easily visualize them as being part of the great silk roads that people talk about 500, 600 years ago, exporting their pottery craft to other parts of the world. You see industries, factories in Ghaziabad and Noida and Okhla and Manesar around Delhi, which is part of the great industrialization game. You see, obviously, all the remnants of colonization around Delhi, right, in central Delhi and around. And then you see the great tech game also playing out. You go to Gurgaon, all the offices there. Noida, all the offices there. Paytm, Zomato, Uber, Ola, Snapdeal, so on and so forth. You'll see all the tech firms, IT services firms, tech startups, all of the offices there. Within an hour, you'll see all of these great games I described coexisting in India. What that suggests to you and to me as I was writing the book is that none of these the great tech game of today is not going to replace the great game of the past, right? We've got to make sure that the farmers in UP and in Bihar and in Haryana, as you can tell from, the protests around farming also, have got to become adopters of technology also, have got to get linked to industrialization also, have got to get linked to like trade also. They cannot remain in a bubble. We cannot have a situation where farmers, for example, as a stakeholder, are thought of only in the perspective of the great agri game of 5,000, 10,000 years ago. You've got to bring them also and link them to the great tech game, which is what some of the agri-tech startups of today in India are trying to do, right? You've got to have better technology being adopted on the farms of India. How to monitor crop health, how to monitor weather patterns, give the farmer of India prior warning that this X disease or this X weather pattern will affect your crop, right? Better insurance technology, right? So on and so forth. So a lot has to be done there in order to make sure that one stakeholder, for example, set of stakeholders, which is a big set of stakeholders in India, also participating and benefiting from the great tech game, right? Now, if you look at, for example, a different perspective, now let's look at are all citizens of India benefiting from the great tech game, or the 100 unicorns that we have, or the large IT services firms that we have from the tech sector? No. Right? The clear answer is no. You still have very core Indian problems of education not being available in the remote parts of India. We have some, I think, fellow students of ours from the Kennedy School who are working in the fields of education and healthcare here. They can vouch for this. Today, the idea that technology should somehow enable remote education or the best education that we can give to our students and our children around the country, we haven't delivered on that promise yet. Healthcare, similarly, right? So I think that the use of technology for solving India's core problems of, let's say, education, healthcare, access to information is still not solved for. It's not easy today for a for every child in India to be part of the great tech game. Many children being born in India today, I can guarantee you, will still unfortunately only be able to participate in the great agri game, so to say, for the rest of their lifetimes, because they've not gotten the education or the healthcare access or the ability to enter engineering colleges or the elite engineering colleges of India or other parts of the country or the world, right, in their lifetime, right? Then there's, of course, the problem of structural unemployment that is being caused by tech, right, which I talk about in the latter part of the book. A lot of people who are in their middle age sort of phase of their lives today will become possibly irrelevant because of artificial intelligence, because of better technology that replaces them in the factories that they work in today or in the offices that they work in today. Similarly for females, right? So let's say technology might disproportionately affect females and those who are less educated, right? So we've got to think about that structural unemployment issue also. So the problems are immense in India, right? If you look at any part of India, and so there's a lot to be thought about in terms of our policy and strategy in order to
Right.
make sure that a much bigger cross section of India gets to participate in the great tech game than just a few elite.
Right. I was listening to you and I was thinking that you didn't, portray a grim on the policy and strategy aspect. So, I was thinking of the power of AI right now in Africa, right? I mean, it's allowing, it's not allowing, but it will allow the opportunity really for African countries to leapfrog, because now language will not be a barrier, or skills will not be a barrier. I mean, using tools like ChatGPT will allow, individuals, small SMEs in remote areas to be able to embark on business ideas or products or services that, they couldn't before, right? So do you think the government of India is using or thinking about technologies like AI in their strategy and planning to integrate it into government programs, to be able to get better gains? I mean, are they thinking about that integration?
So I think that, so AI is a the way I see it, artificial intelligence is a, a new wave within the great tech game, right? If you look at the industrial era again, I'll just use history for a second as an analog. In the industrialization era, also there are three or four very distinct technological waves: the steam engine, electricity, then the automobile, and so on. Now, each of these waves allows new winners to emerge. Actually, the winners in the steam engine era were the UK, etc. But the winners in the electricity wave was the US, not the UK, right? So artificial intelligence is a new wave, let's say, compared to the consumer internet wave that we saw 20 years ago. Um, and let's say the semiconductor and chip and all of the things that enabled Intel and IBM's of the world in the 80s. So there have been these three or four distinct waves already in the great tech game. So yes, it is an opportunity for countries like India to advance and leapfrog, as you say, if they are able to overcome the structural disadvantages that exist. The realist part of me says that the world, the powerful in the world, the tech powers of the world, do not let go of their existing structural advantages that easily. The
Mm-hmm.
US will not do tech transfers that easily.
Mm.
Europe will not transfer its technology. That they will sell it to you, yes. Make money from you, yes. But especially now that they've seen what the Chinese have done over the last 30, 40 years, the US and other countries that today own a lot of this technology, like, for example, ChatGPT, the large language models today, are all being developed and owned by American companies. We have to be clear about that. They are
Mm.
not being developed by Indian companies today, right? We are consumers of artificial intelligence technology, just like we were consumers of industrial technology, just like we were consumers of the consumer internet technology. And so that part of me says actually it's a very pessimistic future for countries that do not own or that are not developing this technology on their own, or at least some parts of this technology. If any of you saw, Sam Altman visited India recently, and who heads OpenAI, developed ChatGPT. And one of the questions asked to him by one of my fellow VCs in India was, do you think India will develop a competitor to ChatGPT or something similar to ChatGPT in the next few years? And Sam said, I don't think so. You will try, but it's going to be very hard for you, right? There have been subsequent clarifications around this, but the core thing was that actually Indian entrepreneurs today do not have access to the kind of technology, the kind of tech infrastructure, the kind of data, and the kind of capital. $10 billion to a startup is unheard of in India. Right? I mean, we are still talking about millions being given to startups to start with, not $10 billion as was given to ChatGPT by Microsoft recently, apparently. So we are at lots of structural disadvantages still, which we have to recognize. We cannot brush over them and say, oh, now somehow because we have 100 unicorns, we'll also become an AI superpower. No, it's not going to be that easy.
But what about our advantage in the data side? I mean, in a country of our population, isn't data one of the greatest, assets in competing in AI? I mean, how can we monetize there? Are we doing good in that area? What can you give us some insights on that piece?
I'll go back to the 5 piece framework I described earlier, right? You can apply it to AI also and say, okay, what all do you have and what all do you not have? Yes, you have data being generated in India. That's correct. And that's something that I think is a positive for us. That's something we need to leverage. But do we have the capital to back entrepreneurs who are building the infrastructure or the algorithms or the large language models, for example, to analyze, study, use that data to build interesting applications? Not so much. If you look at the amount of funding capital that has gone into AI startups in India versus AI startups in the US versus China, India will be like, it'll be peanuts compared to how much money has gone into AI startups in India, in the US and China. So you've got to talk about that aspect too. We cannot just pat ourselves on the back saying, hey, listen, we have 1.5 billion people almost, hence, and we have one of the biggest smartphone markets in the world. That means we have so much data. That means we'll become an AI superpower. No, there's a big leap you've made there from data to becoming an AI superpower. That's the point I'm trying to make. You've got to fill all the other steps also. You've got to have the capital to back entrepreneurs, etc. That's number 2. Are you doing the research that you need to do in India to build the kind of innovative research based applications that you're seeing come out in the US? No. As I've said, India's not doing that much R&D. That's the reality. The Tata Group, the Reliances of the world, the Flipkarts of the world, you take any Indian enterprise in India today, no one is doing enough R&D. 0.1 or 0.2% of Tata's, I think, I shouldn't name them specifically because I don't have the exact data, but you look at any large industrial conglomerate in India today, possibly with the exception of pharma companies, their R&D spend will be 0.2, 0.3% of their top line, max. Whereas in China and in the US and Korea, it might be 10% for some of the most innovative companies, right? It's 10% compared to 0.1%, 0.2%. So, you're not doing the research to build the core IP, either in AI. Number 2, infrastructure. You need large supercomputers, tech infrastructure to process all of this data. India's just, I think, about to get its first supercomputer. There are 250 or 300 supercomputers in the world. India has 1 or 2. The US has over 100. Chinese have about 100 plus, some number like that I've mentioned in the book. So we have a lot of disadvantages also that we've got to catch up on, is my main point. It's not that we don't have some advantages. Many of the people working on AI in the US are of Indian origin. That's a possible advantage for you to leverage. You do have a lot of data being generated every year. That's a possible advantage. But then there are other structural disadvantages that you've got to overcome.
And what about on the policy side? I mean, do you think that we are doing enough to instill protectionist policies around data so we can ensure that we protect our data and use it for our own competitive advantage? Have we fared well in that domain?
See, protectionist policies are very tricky, right? Now, the whole debate around data localization in India was where should the big tech firms of the world store their data, right? They should. The argument for India was they should store it in data centers in India. From a national security standpoint, we should have access to that data. You can have access to that data possibly from a national security standpoint if you need it. But will enterprise big tech firm that's, let's say tomorrow, even storing their data in a data center in India, give access to an entrepreneur in the healthcare space to the data that they want?
Mm.
Like pure, simple commercial logic. Facebook or Google is not going to start sharing its data just because it happens to be stored in a data center in India with an entrepreneur in the healthcare or education space. That's the reality of it.
Right,
Will
right.
data localization in data centers in India really help us? I think it's questionable. What is more important, in my mind, is to think about, see, this is where the UPI India stack piece becomes very interesting, right? Now, that's where you have a philosophy of the data commons. You are saying the data should not be owned by just a few select companies. The data being generated should belong to consumers. Consumers should have the ability to give consent to give that data to any entrepreneur who's building an app on top, right? And certain amounts of anonymized data, non-personally identifiable data, should be available to any entrepreneur in India who wants to build an application on top. That's the way we should go. Because that allows innovation to happen, entrepreneurship to happen on top. That to me is the right philosophy. That's number one. Number two, I talk about in this book. Today, the government, see, historically, governments have been the biggest repositories of data in the world,
That's right.
not private sector. Private
Mhm.
sector was also always asking for data from the government.
That's right.
If you look at the past, right? Now, let's say, for example, trading data, port level data about export. It lies in the hands of the port authorities, often with the government. So any individual exporter of a good today who wants to figure out, okay, where should I export my goods, wants that data, but is not the owner of that data. The owner of the data is actually the government. You want district level, village level agriculture data, crop patterns. The district magistrate of a district in UP or Bihar is the central repository of that data, not a private sector firm, right? So now the traffic toll data. Who owns that data in the country today? Where is traffic going
Mm.
in within India? The government. Now, why am I saying this? The government actually, before we start thinking about how do we take data from Facebook or Google's the world and somehow make it open to the public, should think about, okay, what data am I already sitting upon that I can actually open up to entrepreneurs to allow
Mm.
them to build innovative solutions for India.
That's right.
That's how we should be thinking about, right? So I think there's very different ways in which you can think about it as opposed to just protectionist data localization policies. That's a very myopic thing, unfortunately, that I think we've got stuck on, and disproportionately high amount of public discourse and thinking has gone into it. But really, I think it has to be much broader.
So you're saying that there's an opportunity right there, right, with data to be able to monetize the way we have with Aadhaar or payment structure, and we missed the boat on that, right? You're saying we didn't do that; it was used more for soft power. And so, do you think there's conversation around that? I mean, do you think government is looking at the opportunity to monetize around data, or do you see that conversation again as completely a miss for us?
I've not heard too much about how we're going to leverage um, data that exists within the country and how we'll open that up, with the exception of the UPI, Aadhaar, and the fintech piece.
Mm.
Um, by nature, we are very close guarded with data, and there's also silos that exist. You know, government at the district level, at the village level, at the central level, at the state level are often distinct governments or government entities, right? As you know, and so sharing of data across these or aggregating this data is very hard. There have been efforts. If you go online, there are some public data sets that have been made available by, I think, even MyGov and other arms of the central government and the IT ministry, METI. But I think it's still very, very limited.
Anirudh, we need to open up to some Q&A. Amazing insights. We have someone who left the chat, but she left a few questions. So I wonder if you want to read question 1 and question 2 and pick maybe one that you want to cover.
Yeah, I'll just quickly take Ishani's questions, and then in the meanwhile, maybe others who have questions.
Yes. So others in the group, please think of your question. You can either pose it on video or audio, or write it in the meeting chat.
So Ishani's first question is, how does India increase R&D in a way that doesn't compromise on India's ability to reverse engineer and jugaad and innovate on copying technologies, right? Because obviously copying technologies or jugaad allows cheaper versions to come that can then get adopted by a much broader set of people, right, than expensive technology that's often IP protected, which is a great question, I think. She's mentioned pharma. Obviously, pharma drugs are a great example. Generics manufacturers in India, by doing that R&D, reverse engineering drugs, are able to sell it for much cheaper, and hence greater parts of the Indian population can get access to basic drugs and healthcare, right, that they wouldn't otherwise if drugs were very expensive, as they tend to be patent protected. So great question. Now, I think of it as in not an either or, but as a both type framework. You've got to do both things. You can't continue to just copy and do jugaad and do reverse engineer, because what that does is it solves the problem maybe of letting the technology benefit penetrate into the lower socioeconomic segments of your country. That's correct, by and large. But what it doesn't let you do is actually understand that R&D today is the way to generate and accumulate wealth in the world by having technology that you then license to the rest of the world. By doing jugaad, you are not building that ability to generate wealth. You've maybe solved for part of the access problem at the bottom of the pyramid, so to say, but you've not solved for generating wealth. Unless you grow the pie, there's very little to distribute. We have to be very clear about that. I'm very clear about that. If you do not allow for the pie to become bigger, there is nothing left to distribute. Then you have more conflict actually in the society, because you have a fixed amount of pie, or pie that is shrinking. So then there's more socioeconomic conflict within the country. So you've got to do both. You've got to have a system whereby you're doing more R&D at the enterprise level. Then you've got to allow for startups and other innovators at the bottom or the mid levels to innovate and do the jugaad that India is known for. But also in that jugaad, we've got to be much better and more precise. The reality is the jugaad fitted motor transport vehicle that you'll see in Indian villages is not the most reliable either. So there also we've got to innovate better, right? We sometimes pat ourselves on the back too much for that jugaad. But I think, as many people in the manufacturing space have said, manufacturing excellence requires precision, not cutting corners, right? So you've got to do that better, and you've got to have more R&D being done at the top by the enterprises that have the ability and the ambition and the necessity to do R&D to make wealth, generate wealth. Her second question is, I'll just mention Sujit is also about to leave, or has maybe left, mentions that this R&D piece has to happen across sectors, and that's correct. I agree with Sujit, your point that R&D cannot be only public sector led. There's I believe, a false assumption in many circles, in the private sector circles as well in India, that around the world R&D has always been funded first by the public sector, and then the private sector, or the share of the private sector has to be much lower. The public sector has to take the bulk of the burden here. And that's a assumption from a previous era. Maybe in the 1940s that was true. In the case of the US, for example, the public sector share of R&D was bigger. But today, if you look at the public versus private sector split in the US even, or in other countries like Korea, you'll find that 60-70% of the R&D is being done by the private sector.
Hmm.
It was the reverse maybe in an earlier era. We continue to rely in the private sector also on a assumption from the past that the public sector has to do this. Public sector has the funds to fund research institutions. We in the private sector don't. I think that's a fallacy. We in the private sector continue to see, unfortunately, R&D as an expense item, whereas to me, it's the source of competitive advantage. Unless you do that, you will not have a moat around your business. So that fallacy has to change. Um, Also, we know that the government funded enterprises in India, the reality is that they have not been able to become globally competitive. So why would we expect government funded, entirely government funded research enterprises to become globally competitive? Baffles me. So if you have a discussion that across R&D, private sector, academia, industry, government, cross sectors, R&D has to happen. Private sector has to take a bulk of that load, supported by the government, of course, in certain subsectors that are maybe too far out or very fundamental research. But application-based research, R&D must happen in the private sector.
Anyone for any other questions? We have a few more minutes, and then Anirudh, if not, I have one more question for you, but I'll wait to see if anybody else has questions. We have a few others who have joined.
Good. Sid has mentioned a question, and then Ishani has a question also, a second question. I'll take
Okay.
Sid's question maybe. Should India have adopted a China-like approach to building homegrown tech giants? Are we in danger of being digitally colonized because of the free market approach we've had? That's obviously a great question, has been debated, I think, at length in India also. Even within the tech startup sector, the entrepreneurs are split. Some believe that that open market strategy has been a boon, and some Indian entrepreneurs think it's been a bane. Some want the foreign competitors to be blocked. Some believe that having them in there and having that kind of competition has been very helpful. I believe that, one, should India have adopted a China-like approach in the past? I mean, moot question. Question is, okay, maybe in emerging tech, should we block foreign AI firms or foreign climate tech firms from coming into India? I believe that unfortunately India cannot afford to block technology adoption and penetration in the country. If we had blocked, for example, consumer internet firms, maybe we could have developed like the Chinese did, the Flipkarts and the Olas that we did. Still, there's no doubt in my mind that Indian entrepreneurs today are globally competitive. But I worry that certain emerging technologies, like let's say we can take EV technology, we can take battery technology, we can take a lot of interesting AI technologies. Today, unfortunately, we don't have access to them. And because we have not been spending the money on R&D, we will get left behind even in the adoption and penetration of those technologies in India. And as a result, our population will suffer, our people will suffer because we'll be left behind in the adoption of it and the penetration of those technologies if we completely block the way China did, possibly. Now, are we in danger of being digitally colonized? I mean, and going. Let me just finish the thought and say we've got to do both things. We've got to do the R&D so that our firms have a shot at becoming tech leaders and not just followers. For that, a few years of R&D is required before. It's not suddenly I wake up and I say I'll become a leader in climate tech. No, you can't, because the things that go into solar panels are being IP protected, are being developed somewhere else. As we've realized, they're all being developed in China, right? Similarly in batteries for EVs, right? So it takes a little bit of far minded thinking to say this is what we will need in 10 years. Let's do the R&D starting today so that year 5, year 7, we have the technology that we can then license out to entrepreneurs to build globally competitive firms in that space. That's what we need to do. As opposed to just blocking technology. Are we in danger of being digitally colonized? India is not. India is very large, significant, and strong today. I worry that African nations, smaller nations in Latin America, certainly, those are the nations that are, I think, in danger of being digitally colonized. The Indian government, of course, today is a very strong government, right? When we want to block any unfair practice of a big tech firm, we are able to today, right? Both through our legislation and otherwise by putting pressure, right? So I don't think that we are in danger of being digitally colonized because we have our eyes wide open today. But sneakily, yes, it could happen. But I do think that we should remain an open market economy and let foreign competition come in, but at the same time, equip our entrepreneurs better.
And Anirudh, on the governance side, I mean, are we currently setting the rules? I mean, how do we get a seat at the table? Is India just being a rule setter, or are we, what is our role? Are we getting to shape the global conversation around data or cybersecurity or, AI? What can you give us in terms of insights around the rule setting?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and one of the things I've dedicated a full section and chapter to, right, in setting the rules of the great tech game. That section of the book talks about these things. See, I think that we are unfortunately still, in many ways, playing the game of the past. We still talk about a lot more about the UN Security Council permanent seat
Hmm.
and the fact that India was denied that and a seat at that table, which was
Hmm.
very important for the last 60, 70, 80 years, right? Since the Bretton Woods era started. But I think that the new era of tech governance is seeing a bunch of other technological focused governance institutions like ICANN, ITU, and a whole range of other institutions like that, where the rules of the great tech game are being set. And unfortunately, we are not doing enough as India to get the right seats at the right tables in those tech governance institutions at the global level. And that's a problem.
Hmm.
Because if you look at the last 10, 15 years, China, for example, realized that in the mid 2000s, in the last 15 years, the number of people that are in these tech governance institutions in key roles from China is almost equal to the number of people from Europe that are in these institutions. And Europe has been heavy in these tech governance institutions because many of these tech governance institutions are often based in Europe. Europe is generally very, it's considered a regulatory superpower. They're always thinking about how to set the rules. So they have been there at the table. The Chinese have come on the table. The Americans in the last 4 or 5 years had lost sight of it, but now have come back to emphasizing, having a seat and key roles in these institutions. If you look at some of these institutions like ITU, the American nominated candidate became the chair of the ITU, whereas there was worry 2 3 years ago when I was starting to write the book that the Russian nominated and possibly Chinese backed candidate might become the chairman of this particular institution. And so India is not thinking as much about it, right? Because again, these institutions require to be at the committee level first, then to become member secretaries of these institutions, then to become chairman, right? And govern and set the rules of the game. So we are lagging on that front. One. Second, in emerging technologies like AI, etc., the conversation is still at the principles level, right? But there's now talk about setting up a specific institution to govern AI, for example. Now, that's an interesting space where if that gets developed or if that gets established, India must ensure that we are at that table. And I think we are very likely to be at the table now, given the kind of geopolitical trends that are in our favor as India today, right? I think we'll probably be at that table. We just got to make sure that we have thought deeply about what we want, right? And I think DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure, the India stack, I think will be at the core of what philosophy we want to be enshrined in the principles around any technology. We don't want any technology to become the owner, to be owned by a select few. The philosophy has to be that it must be open as a digital commons, and then let innovation and entrepreneurship win on top.
That's an excellent point. I mean, it's a really, yes, please go ahead, Vinod.
So, great talk, Anirudh. Thank you very much. So I have a couple of comments and then a question in the end. Comment just for the sake of our mutual thinking about it. I think one of the things that just came up is role of public sector government in R&D and research in general, innovation. I think a lot of, if you look at the US or globally, a lot of technology or researches or innovations came from the government institutions. For example, from institutions like NIH or Army, for example, World Wide Web, and a lot of all sort of vaccinations starting from polio, which was supported by the governments. I think definitely that culture has to be stated from the regime, from the government, because that definitely helps. And if you see why we are in terms of IT, whatever power we are, is because maybe it's Andhra government or IT focused by Sam Pitroda and Rajiv Gandhi during those times happened. So that transpired in whatever we see today. The other thing, I also just was thinking that you said that Tom Altman is saying $10 billion investments. So I think the context could also be very different, being first in certain technology in US versus, following that in a country like India, like Peter said that the countries like India or developing countries have to normally follow a different kind of models, like Mangalyaan did, right? We did the whole project in $74 million, which is like a fraction of a similar, I mean, it has been talked very widely about that, how it is a fraction of Hollywood movie budget or a NASA project of a similar kind. So I think it's quite possible, that the new technologies or similar trend could come up in India, competing and challenging the global, leaders. The last thing that I was going to talk and also ask you, there are a lot of talks being happening, and you also said that the threat of being a mass level of people being irrelevant. I hear a lot of talks and hear that it was one thing that being suppressed and being marginalized, and it is another thing which is being irrelevant due to the technology. And that's definitely a bad situation, a very scary situation for countries like, for us in South Asia. So what do you think, as a government or the thinkers from people like you, the countries like India could do, where, on one hand, we are focusing, still bringing a lot of manufacturing and all those kind of, Priyanka also asked that, what is our policies for bringing more and more investments in technology and also manufacturing, different kind of manufacturing. At the other hand, we are being stared by immediate threat that how all those things that we are trying to bring to India, in order to have a trade balance with China or having some GDP boosters, could go back to, say, California, within a year or two. And basically leaving all of us, a large section of our workforce, irrelevant. So where do you see?
Yeah, so I think great question, Vinod. Thank you. Good to see you here.
Thanks.
So, the issue of unemployment versus technology, the historical context obviously goes back to even the Luddites during the industrial era, who said that, setting up factories is going to cause structural unemployment in our society. Let's not adopt industrial technology. Goes back to when the automobile was trying to replace the horse carriage, and people said the driver of the horse carriage will get unemployed now. And so there's always been this trade-off between adoption of technology, development of technology, and employment in society. So nothing new. So we can now look back to those eras and say, okay, what did we do well that time as society? That we can learn from today, as we again face this situation where adoption of technology counterintuitively also causes another big problem in our society, which is that of structural unemployment and irrelevance as you said, which is a real fear for many people. See, there are 2 or 3 things you can do around that. One is that you have to think about which technologies and what technologies you focus on, right, as a country. Saying no to technology is the worst thing we can do, because as I said, technology is the wealth of nations. It's very easy for us to say no to technology, but that will make sure that we just remain a talent nation and labor focused nation, where the key factor of production today has moved from land versus labor to now technology. That's the key productivity growth driver today, technology. So we cannot not adopt technology. Let me make that one point clear. Question now becomes, okay, what kind of technology that we can adopt that might be better suited to India's particular needs? And there, some of the academics that have studied this, Vinod, have talked about this. They've said that there are often 2 kinds of technologies. There's labor replacing technologies that come out, and then there are labor enhancing technologies that come out. Labor replacing technologies are the ones that, for example, very simply put, will say, I don't need X person now here. For example, let's say driverless car, I just don't need a driver. That's a labor replacing technology. These labor replacing technologies, you will find, are often being developed by countries that are short on labor, because that's their constraint. So they're doing the R&D for that, to build driverless cars, because they don't have the labor in the future. So they are saying, let's figure out how to solve that constraint. Now for us, that's not the constraint, clearly. So our R&D and our enterprises should be focusing on labor enhancing technologies. WhatsApp, for example, is a clear example of labor enhancing technology. Today, the farmer is using WhatsApp to get information about his crop, her crop, market rates, etc., weather, etc. The trader or the pottery guy in Khurja that I was referring to, he's using WhatsApp to talk to his buyers in the US and Europe or wherever else in the world, right? That's a labor enhancing technology. It's not taking away that many jobs, but it's making everyone more productive. So broad principle, but the applications will be immense. If India focuses on labor enhancing technologies, we'll be able to, one, keep the people who are there, upskill them, make them more productive, and not just fire them or make them irrelevant. Second, we have to do the right R&D so that we are building more and more of those labor enhancing technologies. Rather than driverless cars, we should be talking about how are we going to make our, let's say, drivers more productive today. An example of which is Uber, Ola, right? I mean, with all the problems that come with that model, the reality is that the driver is now able to do more rides in a given day, right, theoretically, than a driver who was otherwise just sitting at a taxi stand waiting for the consumer to call or consumer to come. Or a truck that can now have the ability to, truck driver who can now easily find goods to bring back also on his return trip, right, versus just having a one-way thing and trying to charge the one guy who's given him business to take goods from A to B for both sides of the trip, right? So these are that's the kind of technologies we should be focused on. And finally, I think upskilling is going to be so important. That's the reality of the world. The world is changing. If we continue to think that we have learned what we've learned at, let's say, at Harvard, and now we don't need to learn anything more, and that we are golden because we studied at premier institutions, we are wrong. We've got to be, not just us, everyone in the country has got to be focused on upskilling. Every new technology and its adoption, we've got to be thinking, because to me, the way I've described it in the book is that, people today in India realize the value of labor and capital. People, if they are running even a small shop, understand that they've got to have a helper, they've got to have a guy who delivers. That's labor. They need help. They realize that. People also realize that to start up a shop, for example, or to farm, they need to have the capital to buy the inputs, the seed, and the fertilizer. They understand that. But people are not giving enough emphasis to the fact that technology is the most important factor of production today. Even more important, I would argue, than land and labor. So whether you are a farmer, whether you're a trader, whether you're a shopkeeper, whether you're an industrialist, whether you're an educator, whether you are a doctor, you've got to think of tech as a factor of production in improving your productivity and adopt it. Whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's WhatsApp, whether it's any other technology that comes about, you've got to become an adopter, even if you're not the developer of that technology.
Excellent question, Vinod, and good to see you.
you.
Anirudh, we are at time, but I thought we would end on a positive note. I wanted to hear your thoughts on PM Modi's visit to the US, and I would love to hear your thoughts on any positive themes that you heard of that are sort of coming about in conversation and agreements around the tech game. I mean, did you hear any themes around climate change or AI or skilling or upskilling?
So the biggest, so lots of it, right? I mean, if you read between the lines also, but you read like the text also, you'll see that technological innovation today is at the core of the US-India partnership, right? Which wasn't the case 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? ICIT, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, is now being talked about as the guiding framework for the US-India partnership to grow further over the next decade. ICIT is all about the great tech game.
Okay.
Right? In many ways, and I've been involved in some way, shape, or form in that as part of my role at Carnegie India as well. Like ICIT, which you will find being talked about everywhere, is a big part of the US-India conversation that happened in Washington D.C. and gently during the US-India even the conversation that led up to this visit of Prime Minister Modi, and all the public statements that have come out, the joint statements that have come out, are talking about ICIT as one of the key things, right? The second, you will have seen there's a lot of conversation around digital public infrastructure there as well. The US and India have agreed to figure out ways in which digital public infrastructure, which is being driven by India globally, to be adopted by various nations, not just India and some others that are in direct conversations with India to adopt it. You're also seeing a lot of tech and capital conversation. The GE co-development MOU is talking a lot about the tech transfer that it entails, right?
Okay.
It's in many ways one of the first times that tech transfer is such a big part of the conversation around these deals, right? It's not been the case in the past. And to be honest, like the kind of reception that Prime Minister Modi has gotten this time around is incredible. I don't think an Indian leader has been given this kind of welcome in the past. Of course, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh got many of the same honors that Prime Minister Modi has gotten this time around. So it's not that this is the first time, but I think the scale at which this has happened this time around and the scope of the conversation that has gone beyond defense or the nuclear deal at the time to now economic, technological, people to people, R&D, etc. To me, it's promising. The thing that we have to be mindful of is that we are able to follow on and execute on a lot of these promises and potential, right? I think there's a lot of work to be done now coming out of this kind of visit that India has seen. There's also, I think, a lot more emphasis that needs to be laid on the economic partnership. I do think that defense and strategic partnership was a much bigger chunk of the conversation this time around. The economic partnership between the two countries and the trade partnership between the two countries is what also deserves a lot more attention over the coming years, because ultimately it's only the economic upliftment of India and India's population that can allow India to actually be a global player and a strategic player and a defense partner for many of the nations in the West today. So that economic growth and development has to be at the core of, I think, the US-India partnership.
Anirudh, we are at time. We've gone over by an hour, but I wonder if you want to take the last question from Ishani Mehta before we close out.
No, I think let's wrap up. I think
Okay, I think we kind of
time and people have been very kindly.
Okay, yeah, we've gone over. Thanks, Anirudh. I urge all of our listeners and future listeners who get access to this video to pick up the book. It's really great in historical insights, very well researched. And I think you've really covered all the critical topics that we need to think about for the next decade or more. And so in that sense, the frameworks are really excellent. And I think this book is here to stay, Anirudh. So really great work on it. And thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to really remembering and following your 5-point framework that you offered us today around talent and capital and core technology, IP and R&D, the policy side, the strategy side, and to seeing India's movement around all of that to build their competitive advantage in this tech game. So thanks for offering that to us and for your time.
Let me, before we close out, thank you, Priyanka, first, because you've really been at the driving end of this to get the India at Harvard group together. We should, I hope that we can continue this kind of conversations with various other authors, people from our community who've written about things or who are thinking about various things, so that the India at Harvard community that we are hoping to rejuvenate and activate globally, we can continue to leverage the work, great work that everyone is doing around the world, of course within India, but around the world, both from our cohorts, but earlier cohorts, later cohorts at Harvard, so that the alumni community can continue to have these kind of conversations. I think I look forward to being on the listening end next time with other folks, so that we can continue the kind of, I think, conversations and debates that we used to have at Kennedy in person, late nights, in classrooms, and in various other settings of the university, so that that can continue as part of our continuing learning and upskilling for ourselves.
That's right. Really looking forward to co-hosting some more talks like this and to really bringing the community together. So this is a great start, Anirudh. Thank you for that. And looking forward to connecting again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you to all that have joined today, and connect to you all soon very much.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.